Well, good morning, everyone. I'm sorry I'm not with you this morning in Vancouver, but I'm attending a graduation ceremony at the University of Ottawa. My nephew Ted is graduating with honors in history, which of course is dear to my heart since that's my undergraduate degree. But Ted lived with my husband and me for 2 years while he was attending the University of Ottawa. So he's become a very special part of our family, and that's why I am here and not with you. But I do want to talk to you about what clearly has become my passion, my favorite topic, because it is an issue, I think, which touches on every single Canadian. We are a death-denying society. We recognize that. We don't want to admit that any of us are going to die. But as I have become somewhat famous for saying at a cabinet table when I could not get anybody's attention, you are going to die. It meant every head came up from the table. And then I said, now I want to talk to you about how you are going to do it. That got their attention. It's unfortunate we can't grab everybody's attention, but I want to talk to you specifically this morning about what has been happening over the last 10 years on the issue of end-of-life care in Canada. As you know, the Senate of Canada has taken a very special interest in this, and it begins with our first report in 1995 of Life and Death. And that was our report on the study of euthanasia and assisted suicide. Senators were, like most Canadians, very divided on the issue of euthanasia and assisted suicide. But where we were not divided at all was our discovery and our concern that the vast majority of Canadians were not getting the kind of care that they required at the time of their death. We did identify that there were some good programs across the country. The first palliative care hospital unit began in St. Boniface in the 1970s, quickly followed 6 weeks later by the Royal Victoria in Montreal. And so there were two pockets of care. Canadians in a variety of places across the country began to put together standalone hospices so they could provide care for dying people. Home care services gradually evolved, but what we learned in 1995 was that it was a very inadequate amount of caregiving that was being provided to vulnerable Canadians, those Canadians who were at the end of their life. Well, because the topic was euthanasia and assisted suicide, it became very easy for the Government of Canada to simply ignore that report. Governments generally like to throw reports on the shelves after they, of course, have said how wonderful it was that somebody wrote that report and how important it all was. Well, that was typical of this report. It got sent on a shelf. It gathered dust. Nothing, and I mean nothing, was done to effectively change the federal government's attitude about the delivery of quality end-of-life care. Now, we all recognize that the delivery of care is primarily a provincial responsibility, except in specific target areas, such as our troops, our correctional institutions in this country, and of course, above all, our Aboriginal people. But for the most part, health care is a provincial territorial issue. But the federal government did have some roles to play, and they weren't playing them. In the fall of 1999, I decided that it was time to examine what I knew anecdotally was not happening, but I needed to get some hardcore facts. And so I gathered a group of senators together who had been part of the original report in 1995, and we did a very quick study just on those portions of our 1995 report in which we were unanimous. We came together, we studied, heard witnesses, and in June of 2000, exactly 5 years after the first report, we tabled our second report. The second report was called End-of-Life Care, Quality End-of-Life Care, the Right of Every Canadian. I remember one palliative care physician on radio the next day who said, "I think I've died and gone to heaven." Obviously he hadn't, but he heard, I think for the first time, some very strong recommendations that had to happen if indeed we were going to get that quality end-of-life care for all Canadians. As a result of that report, I decided that I would personally commit myself to 2 years for the Canadian Hospice and Palliative Care Association. As you may or may not know, senators and members of Parliament have travel points, which we can use to traverse this country. I decided that I would use my travel points to go from coast to coast to coast, to talk to Canadians, to educate Canadians, and thereby educate the federal government about what we could do to effectively change the way in which we were delivering care for dying Canadians. That began in June of 2000. And then a number of things came together. I think the stars must have been in the right positions, because through the auspices of the Canadian Hospice and Palliative Care Association, we formed an end-of-life coalition. I think most of you in this audience recognize that palliative care has been primarily cancer-oriented, and for very good reasons. Many people dying with cancer have enormous pain, and an essential part of palliative care, of course, is pain relief. But palliative care is much more than just the relieving of pain. It's also the spiritual help that families require. It's the home care that individuals require just to look after those things they cannot look after themselves. It's spiritual care in the way in which both social workers and ministers and members of faith communities can provide the care that is required at end of life. And we knew, therefore, that it wasn't just cancer patients that required this particular service. People die of ALS, people die of cardiac failure, people die of Hodgkin's disease, they die of Parkinson's disease. There are many disease communities far outside cancer in which individuals still need quality end-of-life care in those difficult final years or months or days of the end of their lives. So in December of 2000, with the help and the support of the Canadian Hospice Palliative Care Association, we established an end-of-life coalition, bringing all of the groups together, or many of the groups together, in order to say, look, we want to work together on the vision of the Senate report, which was a national strategy on end-of-life care. It was kind of amusing that at that particular meeting, rumors had already begun that I might be the next government leader of the Senate. I wasn't sure how serious those rumors were, but I remember saying to Janet Dunbarack, who was then the executive director of the Canadian Hospice and Palliative Care Association, wouldn't it be funny if I became the government leader in the Senate, and then I could ask the Prime Minister to make me the minister with special responsibility for palliative care? We had a good chuckle over that, but on January the 9th, just 3 weeks later, I got a call from the Prime Minister, and he asked me if I would become the government leader in the Senate. I accepted, but I also suggested that I'd like to become the minister with special responsibility for palliative care. Now, Mr. Chrétien's first reaction to that was, why would someone want to be the minister with special responsibility for palliative care? But I told him of my passion and my concern, and he said, well, then why don't you do it? But I won't give you any money. I said, well, that's all right, Prime Minister. I will use everybody else's budget to try and accomplish what I think needs to be accomplished in this field. And so within 6 months of going from our report in June of 2000 to January of 2001, we now had a government leader in the Senate sitting at the cabinet table who had a significant interest in the issue of hospice and palliative care. And let me tell you that while I think we accomplished a great number of things in the 3 years in which I held that position, there is no way that I can say that I did that by myself, because I didn't. What was quite an amazing thing was that as I asked each staff member if they would be willing, in addition to the job that they did as a staff person to the leader of the government of the Senate, if they would also give me some hours a week to dedicate to the issue of hospice palliative care, every single one of them said yes. Now, you could say, well, pretty hard to say no to the boss, But it wasn't just that. It was that when I shared with them my concern, my passion for this issue, they all said, this is something that we can do. We're going to have parents. We're going to, unfortunately, have grandparents. We may even have children who will find themselves in this very vulnerable status and situation. And we want to help you change things for Canadians who are vulnerable. So by working as a staff and by working with my cabinet colleagues who, when they understood that I was simply not going to let them forget that I was the minister with special responsibility for palliative care, we began to make some changes. The group of staff sat down and we decided that there were 3 genuine areas that we needed to reform. The first was that we needed to find a mechanism whereby Canadians could take some quality time with family members. That led to the Compassionate Care Program. The Compassionate Care Program that was launched in January of 2004 gives Canadians 8 weeks of EI benefits in order to stay home with a dying family member. Now, we all recognize that that's not enough and some changes need to be made, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But we got a foot in the door. We made it possible for family members to go on EI, to serve a 2-week waiting period, or 1 week if in fact there was more than one member of a family willing to share in the care of this individual. And they could get 6 weeks of benefit in order to take that quality time. Now, we did not intend that this would be for the actual physical care of the person who was dying. This was for the support, the emotional support, the homemaking support, the spiritual support, the ability for a young man who's working on an oil field in Fort McMurray to go back to an oat port in Newfoundland and spend 6 weeks with his dying mum. That's what this program was to be all about. And it wasn't hard to convince anyone, once we put the concept on the table, that this was a good way to go. Certainly Jane Stewart, who was the Human Resources Minister under whom EI fell, immediately indicated that this was a good thing to do. Alex Himmelfarb, who was Clerk of the Privy Council, sat in my office and said, well, why wouldn't we do this? And so it was an easy sell. Even the business community that is sometimes reluctant to let employees go for long-term maternity benefits or other benefits that come under EI said, well, this could happen to us, and we would want to spend some time with a dying loved one. So we were able to make that happen relatively quickly. Well, quickly in government terms, because nothing ever happens quickly in government. But we began our push in 2001, we got it approved in 2003, and it actually took effect in January 2004, so for government that's pretty fast action. The second issue that was critical to me and to the group that I was working with, including the Canadian Hospice and Palliative Care Association and the End of Life Coalition, was the training of physicians. We knew that, quite frankly, the average amount of training that a physician received in medical schools in Canada was 1 hour over 4 years. 1 hour of caring for the dying, and usually that involved pain relief. Nothing else. And it became critical if we were going to change attitudes, if we were going to change medical practice, that medicine understand the need for the physicians of this country to be trained in undergraduate palliative care. That was an interesting concept when we first took it to the Canadian Medical Association and to the College of Physicians and Surgeons. But with a little bit of persuasion, they were persuaded that this could be done. Of course, I had to get some money, and we were able to access $1.25 million for them to develop curriculum. I'm pleased to tell this group that by the year 2008, which is only 3 years away, There will not be a single graduate of one of our 17 medical schools in Canada that will not have had training in quality end-of-life care. That, I believe, will significantly change attitudes of physicians in this country. Because when we were writing the report back in 1995, we actually heard anecdotal stories about patients going to doctors, being told, well, you're terminal, you have 3 months to live, and by the way, I'm no longer your doctor because I don't know how to treat you. That will no longer be the case. They will know how to treat them. And again, not fast enough, but coupled with what the Pallium Project is doing in Calgary in the educating of physicians who are currently in practice and other healthcare professions, coupled with the work that the Ian Anderson Foundation is doing for family physicians, family practice physicians, in terms of educating those already in practice, there is a changing attitude going on out there, and there is the recognition that physicians have to care for the dying as well as the living. I gave a speech in Portugal in November of 2003, and one of the individuals in the audience raised the question, why are you so insistent on this, Senator Carstairs? Why do you insist that all physicians be trained in quality end-of-life care? Well, I turned to the audience and I said, do you think that every physician in this country, Portugal, should be trained in the delivery of a baby? Would you want someone to graduate from medical school not being able to deliver a baby? And you could see by all the no's from the audience that no, they simply didn't think that that would be appropriate. And then I said, well, only 50% of your patients potentially, if they're gender-based, are going to deliver a baby. But 100% of a physician's patients are eventually going to die. So it is absolutely critical that our physicians be trained in quality end-of-life care. The third area was research. When we started the report in 1995, we could estimate that maybe $200,000 a year was being spent on research. Between, of course, the early period of 95 and into the early 2000s, there was a significant change in the way research was conducted in this country. The old Medical Research Council was replaced with the Canadian Institutes for Health Research. And originally I'd hoped that one of those institutes would be dedicated to end-of-life care, and it was the reason I chose to sponsor that bill, which was C-13, in the Senate of Canada, was in my ultimate hope that maybe one of the CIHRs would be dedicated to palliative care. Well, it turned out that we got the bill and we got the CIHRs, which has been a tremendous improvement in research in Canada, but it was also decided that one of them would not be on palliative care. So I said, well, then I have to meet with all the scientific directors and see if I can't persuade them that palliative care was part of their business. So I went to a breakfast meeting and I spoke to them and said, you know, palliative care is all of your business. And they looked at me somewhat skeptically. And I remember the cardiologist, CIHR, and the head of it, the scientific director, saying to me, well, why is this of interest to me? And I said, Doctor, none of your patients die? And he said, well, of course my patients die. And I said, well, then you should be interested. So what's happened is that we now have 6 of the 13 CIHRs actually working in the area of palliative care. They are doing research. And the research dollars have increased from $200,000 a year to a government and CIHR commitment of $16.5 million over the next 5 years, as announced in September of 2004. So tremendous changes have occurred, positive changes. There were some other things that we also were able to launch at the same time. One of the most exciting ones for me, because it of course occurred in Winnipeg, was the launch of the virtual hospice. If you go on your website, www.virtualhospice.ca, you can find out a great deal about palliative medicine. And your questions will be answered. It is to some degree interactive, and that there is a physician and a nurse who will indeed respond to your queries and your questions. There are ways in which you can enter chat rooms and provide yourself with more information. There's also information available to doctors, to nurses, to patients, to their families. And when I first proposed the idea of this kind of a website, I remember one individual at a conference in Kelowna, British Columbia, saying to me, "You know, I don't think I want to talk to a computer when I'm dying." And yet someone who was also at that same meeting told those gathered that she was getting the greatest support in her fight with cancer and her acceptance of the fact that she only had a very short time to live on a website coming from St. John's, Newfoundland. So we're in the era of new technology, and people can get information from sites like Virtual Hospice. Last I spoke with Harvey Chachanoff and Anita Stern, they had over 700,000 hits on this website. So Canadians are getting information, valuable information, in both official languages from www.virtualhospice.ca. So those are some of the good things that have happened. Now I want to talk to you about what hasn't happened and where it is we still have to go. One of the things we did in Health Canada was to establish a secretariat in June of 2001. The idea of this was to establish a national strategy, to bring together the provinces, the federal government, the territories, to discuss ways that they could coordinate activities, to work together, to share information, to learn about best practices. Well, I have to say we still don't have a genuine national strategy in Canada. The Secretariat does exist, but quite frankly, it's inadequately funded and it's inadequately staffed. And that is a requirement that we must do something about in the next few years. Hopefully, we will see some of those changes. We saw positive things come out of the first health accord in September of 2003, where for the first time, hospice palliative care and end-of-life care got a mention, got a recognition that this was a part of our healthcare system. But the health accord that was signed in 2004 was even much more positive, because in that accord, it recognized that home care must be a service which can be funded by the federal government. And so for the first time, the federal government has said, yes, we will put monies aside so that the provinces can not only get support for those programs that we presently fund, but can also get first dollar coverage for some parts of home care. And they identified a number of areas. The one most important to us, of course, was the palliative care model. And it's interesting that in the budget of Ontario, just last month, in May 2005, has announced $39 million for palliative care. For the first time, Ontario is looking at making hospice palliative care a core service. Now, it is a core service in a number of other provinces, but Ontario had not made it a core service. And as the largest population base in the country, often where Canada goes is where Ontario goes. And so that announcement, quite frankly, by the Ontario government in its budget is very, very exciting. But we have to make sure that the home care definition is as broad as possible. Home has to be defined by the patient. Home may be your house. Home may be your apartment. But home may be your long-term personal care. That's where you have now gone to end your life. That has become your home. And in some circumstances, it is impossible to look after patients in their homes. Perhaps they have no family that can make those services possible. And so we have to define hospice as part of home care. So the definition of home care must be the broadest possible. Provinces have, since 1995, one after another, passed advance directive legislation, living wills as we sometimes refer to them. And Terry Schiavo's case in the United States has made it so critical as to why we need advance directives. But I think those of you in the audience know that, again, they're not well coordinated. Yes, Ontario will recognize my advance directive signed in Ontario, and so will Manitoba, but other provinces won't. And 2 territories still don't have them, Nunavut and the Northwest Territories. So it is important for us to have advance directives, but we know that the most important part of advance directive is family planning, where families will sit down and talk together about what is in that advance directive, what mom or dad or grandma wants done, or what they don't want done at the end of their life. We know that we have to significantly change the benefit program for compassionate care. It's not long enough. The definitions are too narrow. I have spoken with the minister, now Madame Robillard. She has indicated to me that changes are on the way, and I believe her. I personally believe that it is the patient who should determine who their caregiver is going to be. So, what's happened? Well, we had a report in 95, we had a report in 2000, and God willing, if there isn't an election called before the 2nd of June, I will, in fact, have tabled yet a 3rd report in the Senate of Canada, again outlining the good things that we have done, but more importantly, telling Canadians where we must go. And above all, we must talk. We must make Canadians understand that death is a natural part of living, and that if we have quality end-of-life care, then Canadians will live well until the very end. Thank you. Have a wonderful conference.